Welcome back to the Green Radio Hour with Jon Bowermaster here on Radio Kingston, streaming live and archived always at radiokingston.org. Over the past few years, we've checked in with some regularity with former Times reporter Ian Urbina and his Outlaw Ocean Project, which continues to do an incredible job tracking down stories of human rights and environmental abuses in the far corners of the planet's one ocean. Last time we talked, I interviewed a whistleblower, an American lured to India to manage a frozen shrimp business that was clearly breaking every rule. He walked away from a $300,000 a year job after just a couple months, after observing massive problems with drugs being used in the processing procedures for shrimp headed mostly to U.S. grocers, and slave-like working conditions. Ian and the Outlaw Ocean reporting team are back with an extensive series on how flagrantly the Chinese and its fleet of 6,000 distant water fishing ships are scouring the ocean for its last fish. One of the most insidious tricks is something called flagging in, which I'll let Ian and others explain in detail. The bottom line is that poor countries are selling access to what are legally their own fishing grounds, a slightly just legal mechanism allowing them to go in and essentially hoover up fish that should most appropriately be saved for the dozen poor countries selling access. Here's Ian Urbina.
But incursions by Chinese fishing vessels into other countries' territorial waters is a common occurrence. Some of these incursions are illegal in nature when fishing vessels surreptitiously enter the economic exclusive zones of other countries. But recently, more and more, Chinese companies are using a legal loophole to exploit local waters. From South America to Africa to the far Pacific, China has been buying its way into restricted national fishing grounds, primarily using a process known as flagging in. This is a method where Chinese companies use local business partnerships to register their ships under the flag of another country, allowing them to fish in that country's territorial waters. For China, this soft power strategy represents a new approach for gaining dominance over the global seafood market. Subtler than simply entering foreign coastal areas to fish illegally, flagging in is less likely to result in political clashes, bad press, or sunken vessels. Investigators at the Outlaw Ocean Project have identified over a dozen countries where Chinese ships have flagged in. The seafood that these ships extract is often sent back to China for processing, and then exported to wealthier consumers, like those in the US or Europe. As part of a 4-year investigation into China's distant water fishing fleet, a team of reporters from the Outlaw Ocean Project boarded Chinese fishing vessels off the coast of West Africa, the high seas near the Galapagos Islands, and an area known as the Blue Hole near the Falkland Islands. They encountered a range of human rights concerns and labor violations, including inhumane living conditions, passport confiscation, malnutrition, workers on shifts lasting up to 2 days, and deckhands claiming to be held against their will.
That was Ian Urbina, the chief of the Outlaw Ocean Project. The most recent addition to the Outlaw Ocean site is headlined "China Taking Over from the Inside." I spoke to one of those lead reporters on the Outlaw Ocean story that Ian described. Pete McKenzie called in from his home in New Zealand. He first reinforced the variety of ways China's voracious deep ocean fishing fleet is methodically accessing what are supposed to be economic exclusionary zones for their own purposes. Here's Pete McKenzie.
National registries. So that might be through buying local companies and taking them over from the outside. It might be through registering shell companies through kind of local proxies in the country. Whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. Chinese companies, for the most part, exerting enormous control over local domestic fisheries and allowing their ships to infiltrate a place that they're not supposed to be.
Each country gets, what do they call it, an economic free zone, which is what, 2 or 3 miles off the shores?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit larger than that, but yeah, the economic exclusive zone. And so there's all sorts of boundaries, territorial waters, maritime domain, exclusive economic zone. But generally, the core element of it is that there is a portion of the ocean off of a country's coastline, which is under that country's domain, under that country's control. And usually, what countries do is they limit who can access it so that their own ships, their own domestic fishing industries can take advantage of it, can thrive in that space. And what flagging in does is bring ships from the outside in.
In the good old days, China and others would probably just invade that free zone and do whatever they wanted. And this way, they're kind of doing it by the book, by negotiating with Argentina in this case, this example, by saying, we'll buy our way in. Is that kind of a fair description?
Yeah, exactly. I think buy our way in is the best way to describe it. And what was really striking to me from the reporting, the Outlaw Ocean Project sent me over to Argentina to report this as part of our kind of reporting on flagging in all across the world, from the Pacific to Africa to South America. But when I arrived in Argentina and when I was talking to fishing captains, when I was talking to government officials, everyone kind of knew that this was going on. It was an open secret, and as a result, nobody really cared. And so it took, someone from the outside coming in and being able to document the true scope of this. A really substantial part of Argentina's fishing industry is now effectively Chinese. Someone to document that, someone to highlight that growth for people to actually start thinking, holy crap, this is a problem that we've got to start to grapple with.
Yeah. And what's, as argument, what's the matter with that? China, if they're giving Argentina something it needs, which is money to do with whatever it needs, and China's taking it back and providing food for their citizens, but also for export around the world, etc. What's the downside?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because if it was just, a country buying its way into an overseas fishing area, that might not be a massive problem. The challenge is that the Chinese fishing fleet in particular has a really problematic history in all sorts of respects. So, when we were in Argentina, as in places like Ghana, as in places like Vanuatu, we were coming across all of these instances of Chinese vessels engaged in illegal fishing or environmentally problematic fishing. We found cases of worker exploitation and worker abuse. We found cases of alleged corruption. In every case, we were finding a really checkered history on these boats that had bought their way into these industries. And that had devastating effects. In Ghana, for example, these largely Chinese fleets that were buying their way inside were fishing juvenile fish, and as a result, the fishing industry there was collapsing. Local fishermen were having their incomes cut by a third or more because there just weren't enough fish left as a result of these deeply unsustainable practices. In Argentina, similarly, we were coming across cases of, a worker dying on board one ship, or, illegal vessels kind of crossing into Argentinian waters and then their company being able to legally secure a different way in. And what all that spoke to is that when you have foreign companies, foreign countries gaining more control over your own domestic fishing industry, you're much less able to exert control over that industry as a result. It's much harder to scrutinize, it's much harder to monitor what is happening on the ships that are suddenly in your waters. And therefore you become exposed to all of these deeply worrying and deeply challenging practices.
Yeah. And I think for those who are not aware, if you could describe just how big this Chinese fishing fleet is, because I know the numbers and I'm stunned every time I see them.
Yeah, well, the high seas fishing fleet is enormous in the thousands. It's by far the world's largest high seas fishing fleet.
And largest by like 5 times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a deliberate tool by China. It has this voracious appetite because its economy is so large, because its population is so large, for fish. But more than that, it's become a tool of diplomacy, a tool of geostrategy. And that's what we saw with flagging in particular. We were seeing hundreds of ships being flagged in across the world. And that was part of a wider practice by China in continents like Africa, in continents like South America, where it played into a wider press for influence, where China is investing billions of dollars in resource projects, billions of dollars in currency swaps and financial support for these countries, and this kind of expansion in the fishing industry, all of which ensured that when China had a problem, it could go to the Argentinian foreign minister and say, hey, this is not okay. We want you to do something differently. And they had to listen.
So basically, China is buying its way into some of the most fertile fishing grounds in the world. And what do they do with it? They, as you suggest, they have to probably dump the juveniles, which have not much value back home. They take everything back to China. They feed it to their own public, and then they export it. What do we know about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. This story was part of a wider series by the Outlaw Ocean Project that documented the ways in which fish are caught by Chinese companies, and then the way in which those fish are sent abroad. And what we consistently found was that the way in which that fish is processed is deeply worrying. We were finding cases of forced Uyghur labor in remote parts of China processing these fish and then exporting that fish to countries like the United States, to places like the European Union, to places like Japan and Australia. Countries and regions that think of themselves as having a reliable slavery-free supply chain, when in reality that's anything but. And what I think that tells us is that this is a global story. This matters to everyone, because it's as simple as the fish on your plate at a Sunday dinner being tainted with traces of slave labor, being tainted with traces of exploitation.
And are other countries besides China flagging in?
Yeah, so, we saw countries in all sorts of places doing this. Iceland was doing some of this. We saw Spain doing some of this. But by far, China was the largest player. It was the only country where it was doing it all across the world, and it was the only country doing it in the kind of scale that is truly worrying.
And the video that is on the opening page of your China reporting shows a ship being sunk in Argentine waters. Were you there for that?
I wasn't. I wish I was. But I think what that video speaks to, what that experience tells us, is that this is real in its violence. It's very easy to think of fishing as kind of a quaint or a safe activity. But often, when we see countries going head to head on how their fishing industries are treated, how their fishing vessels are treated, it is a violent, anarchic world where people are killed, people are enslaved, and vessels get sunk. This is, conflict in its rawest sense, and it deserves all the focus that it can get.
Yeah. Well, in your piece, this ship, well, I guess it wasn't just the ship that was sunk, but on other ships that you and others observed and went aboard, I guess, just the conditions, the working conditions are just horrific. I think the description of this was they're catching squid off the coast of Patagonia and Argentina, and there's just like squid ink everywhere, and people are living in squid and squalor, and they're not, they're working 15 hours a day, 6 days a week. They can't leave if they want. It's not an option. It truly is slave labor.
Absolutely. Our team has done amazing work where they've gone that extra distance. Members of our reporting team have boarded these vessels, have gone out to the high seas, gone out to places where no other reporter has had the time or resources to go. And what they found there is terrifying. These vessels, the conditions there are hellish, and I don't use that word lightly. years of eating basically 2-minute noodles, and as a result, these kind of wasting diseases where your flesh begins to rot and your body begins to break down. Incredibly cramped quarters where you can barely move when you finish your, 16, 18, 20-hour day or more. We were hearing reports of people working for days at a time and working for years at a time without being able to go home, not being permitted to go home because their papers had been taken, their passports had been taken. They weren't told when they were going to leave or if they were going to leave. These are people who are in the most dire of circumstances, and they often just get forgotten.
Yeah. Well, in our film Ghost Fleet, which I'll send you a link.
Yeah.
We were focused mostly on escaped slaves, and these were guys who had lived through all those conditions you just described, and just decided that it was better to swim for it, to jump off the boat and swim for any nearby piece of land that they could. But then they were so scared of officialdom that they would live in the jungle for a year sometimes, hiding from people because they couldn't trust anyone. Because the last time they had trusted someone, they were shanghaied and put on a fishing boat and not able to leave. We interviewed a guy who'd been he'd been a slave for a half dozen years, but he'd been away from home for 24 years. They forget their home language, as you suggest. They have no passport, they have no money, they have no ID. They can't even really tell you where they're from sometimes. No, it's remarkable and horrific. And I know that Ian Rubina, who you work with at the Outlaw Ocean Project, has reported a lot on this whole issue of slavery and forced labor. But and other than Argentina and you said there are probably a dozen other countries that are selling these flagging rights.
Yeah, we documented cases across the world, and largely in the global south, which I think is extremely important because these are vulnerable countries which are in dire need of cash, whose regulations are lax, and where people are willing to, abide by the letter but not the spirit of the law, or even to twist the law itself. And that provides openings for countries or for companies that are unscrupulous in the way in which they engage with fishing.
And do you know if any of the Outlaw Ocean reporting has gotten back to the Chinese and what their reaction is when these stories are circulated literally around the globe?
Yeah, that's the beauty of what the Outlaw Ocean Project does, is we're able to disseminate our reporting all across the world with dozens of reporting partners in countless different countries. The Chinese fishing industry is a bit of a black box. They're extremely hard to engage with and extremely reluctant to engage. So we're not sure, what, if anything, they make of it. When we reached out for comment, they didn't respond. But what we do know is that it is having an impact in the countries where this is happening. To take Argentina as an example, there was this kind of burst of attention when our reporting came out because suddenly people were paying attention. Suddenly people saw the problem for what it was. And that, as a result, demands a response from the government officials and the governmental representatives who have let that kind of problem fester for so long.
But based on your years of reporting, can you imagine that the Chinese don't understand the future of the oceans if we continue to overfish like they are now? Are they just are they under the impression that it will just keep replicating and there'll always be fish? And someone in that government must be looking at the potential for one day, running out of fish.
Yeah, I imagine so. I can't speak for the Chinese government. What I think is important is that it's such a sprawling entity that, one person might be intensely focused on the increasingly real possibility of an ocean so depleted that it is that it's unusable. But there are so many competing incentives for China as it engages in this kind of rise in global power and prominence to use the fishing industry as so many other elements of its government as a tool. And I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing the fishing industry being used as a tool of power, and the way in which countries all around the world respond will become really significant as a result.
And the Chinese have a distant water shipping fleet of about 6,000 boats, and it's run by an entity called the Chinese National Fisheries Corporation. Are we to assume that that's not private industry, that that's government operated and government funded?
Well, China has been extremely explicit in recent years that even private companies have a role to play in China's rise. It's passed legislation to that effect. It's made it extremely clear that private entity has to work hand in glove with the government. But even beyond that, many of the largest enterprises in the Chinese fishing industry are state-owned or state partners, and as a result are even more tightly woven into the ways in which China as a government is interacting with the rest of the world. And so it means that when we're looking at these problems, we have to assume that it's being done with the blessing or at the direction of members of the Chinese government.
And when I read many of the Outlaw Ocean stories, I see references to various reporters, whether they're videographers or writers or photographers, actually gaining access on occasion to ships, to fishing ships, which has to be, I was going to say, has to be awkward. It has to be slightly awkward and dangerous, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the remarkable thing about the Outlaw Ocean team is that these are journalists who are willing to go the extra mile, who are willing to put themselves at risk, because the ocean is a dangerous place. These are lawless frontiers. These are lawless vessels. And so when, my reporting partner, Ian, when other members of the Outlaw Ocean team approach these vessels on the high seas, they don't know what to expect. They were lucky in many cases to find fishing vessels that were willing to bring them on board. And often that involved a delicate dance of, not potentially naming the captain, being kind of discreet about, the names of vessels, but often not. Often they were able to be extremely, extremely open about it. And what that allowed for, what going that extra mile allowed for, was the kinds of hellish and dystopian scenes that we were talking about earlier, the kind of exploitation that we see on board those vessels.
And Ian and some of his team have even been arrested. Where was that? In Libya, I believe, in the desert of Libya.
Yeah, I believe that's true. Yeah, and that just speaks to the kind of journalist Ian is. He strikes me as fearless, and I'm sure he would reject that. But he and so many members of the Outlaw Ocean team are so committed to this work, committed to shining a light on a fishing industry that has gone unfocused on and unlooked at for so long.
Yeah, but let's not make let's not mistake ourselves. The Outlaw Ocean Project does not, doesn't have a boat. Doesn't have a reputation for ramming vessels that are illegally fishing. Leave that for others, I guess. But that scene, and I'll encourage people to watch the video at Outlaw Ocean that opens your reporting piece of the ship being sunk looks like by automatic weapon, by gunfire. The ship must have been in pretty bad shape. That it wasn't a rocket or a grenades that blew it up. It was bullets from a rifle.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's remarkable that they were able to have that much of impact, and I think that speaks to how kind of dangerous and how terrifying it must be to be on such rickety vessels. Right, you're operating really at the margins of existence.
And so, what is your next on sea reporting job? Do you know?
Well, I can't reveal too much, but I'm excited to be back in New Zealand, and which is where I'm based, and I'm looking forward to some reporting projects close to home.
But where else can people find your writing if interested?
Yeah, so I'm able to follow it in the variety of outlets I write for, largely for the New York Times, The Guardian, The Economist. If they follow me on Twitter at peter.t.mckenzie, they'll be able to follow a lot of my work.
Nice. Well, I know that nothing bad can be happening in and around New Zealand. New Zealand is Snow White.
Yeah, exactly. It's a global reputation that is not entirely deserved. And I think that is an important point. The reason it's so important to have journalists all across the world is that there are countless countries whose reputation obscures a much darker truth.
Yeah. Well, and as I'm sure you see from your vantage point down there in the southern hemisphere, the growth of China and the spread of its power is remarkable. We were talking at the start of the conversation about efforts that they're undertaking in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, where they're literally not building roads anymore. They're building in the Maldives. They're building entire islands. So, and when you travel, the spread of Chinese tourists, Chinese travelers is incredible, because they have a middle class now of 500 million people, who have disposable income and can get around, and it's remarkable to watch.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, right? China is a rising power, and China has this kind of remarkable foreign reach these days, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's great to be engaging with the rest of the world. It's great to have those kinds of people-to-people connections. The focus has to be, though, in this journalistic project and in so many others, making sure that every country, China and others, is playing by the rules as that engagement unfolds, and that we're not seeing the kind of really quite toxic effects that can happen as a result.
Yeah, and it doesn't work internationally if they're sailing around the world and vacuuming up all the fish in the sea, because that impacts everyone, all of us, and impacts their own citizens. So that shouldn't last, and hopefully it won't. But anyway, Pete, thanks for the conversation, and thanks for all your reporting, and we'll keep watching. Yeah, thanks to Pete McKenzie of the Outlaw Ocean Project and to its entire team. To recap, over the past 3 decades, China has gained supremacy over global fishing by dominating the high seas with more than 6,000 distant water ships, a fleet that is more than triple the size of the next largest national fleet. The Chinese are everywhere, all over the ocean. And when it came to targeting other countries' waters, Chinese fishing ships typically used to sit on the outside, so park in the international waters along sea borders, then run incursions across the line into domestic waters, illegally. In recent years, they've gotten smarter and tried this softer approach where they gain control from the inside by paying to flag in their ships so they can fish in domestic waters. It's an interesting dance they're doing. If you're not familiar with the Outlaw Ocean site, pay attention to it. Maybe especially this new reporting on China, which is intensive. And then, of course, keep all that you learn in mind next time you're at the Olive Garden tempted by the tilapia.